So let's get to it. Let's quickly start with who we all are and why this whole webinar series exists and who is behind it. So first of all, this is the first episode of season 2. Season 1, if you've already been part of it, was called Fireside Chats. Now we rebranded it to Let's Talk UX. And as I said, this is the very first episode, so welcome. Writing history together with us. And so basically, we're still the same people behind it. First of all, I'm Sandro. I'm working at Testing Time here in Zurich. We are a study participants recruiting agency. We have a pool of 350,000 people. And if you need study participants in the UK, Germany, Switzerland, France, Netherlands, we can deliver them to you in 48 hours. And our partner for a couple of years now already is UX Live, and the partner company behind UX Live, Tech Circus. And actually, UX Live is a big conference that's happening, like a 3-day conference that's happening in London in November. So this year it's going to be from November 11th till November 13th. And actually, Steve is going to have a talk there. And so this is kind of a precursor to wet your tongue a little bit for what an interesting person he is and all the stuff he has done. And so it's going to take place at the Excel Center in London. And actually, Mike from Tech Circus will share the link with you in the chat in a bit. And so basically, what is it? UX Live is like there's going to be many speakers. There's going to be workshops. There's going to be it's like a leadership stage, a practitioner stage, and a panel stage. And it's mainly a conference for UX researchers and UX designers. But you can check out the link, and there's also a small offer at the end where you can get the tickets a little bit cheaper. So I will share that with you at the end. So bear with me there. Okay, that's for that. And then now to you, Steve. I have to almost read your accolades here so that I don't forget any. So Steve, or Buzz, how they call him, we'll learn later why, has built some of the most loved products and brands on this planet, I would say. So there is Lego, there is Alexander McQueen, the eccentric fashion label, Jamie Oliver, Skype, Microsoft. He worked at Microsoft after Skype has been bought. He's also on the board of the Design Council of the UK. And then he's board of directors of the Design Business Association. And actually, one funny thing I saw is that Steve has designed some of my favorite, I hope you see my screen here, some of my favorite emoticons. I always really like this one, and I always really like this one. So Steve, you have basically, when you joined Skype, which apps have already existed? Because I definitely remember the desktop apps, but then when I kind of browse through what you've done on this website, is I saw, there is apps for Skype for TVs. There was one integration with Facebook. Then there is, I think, for Xbox as well, and then you have for all the different mobile phone versions that are out there. And so, my first question would be for you: how did you go about that? I mean, we talk a lot about design systems today and atomic design and all this kind of stuff. Like so you started at Skype, and then how did you think about that? And welcome first. So welcome, Steve. The mic is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Sandro. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I hope you can all hear me okay. Thanks for the questions. I hope this will be interesting for folks. I'll be very honest and upfront about my failings as well and the things that I've learned. Skype was a bit of a rocket ship. You probably remember back in the day. it had probably been the most fastest growing app of all time around sort of 2010. And we had very early on cracked what is called the viral coefficient. The viral coefficient is basically how many people does one user bring into the system, and you're looking to get that as close to 1. So you can never Skype alone. So of course our growth was double digits. We didn't actually have to do that much because we cracked that early on. So of course, when you're looking at where people are using the app and their demands, we were very clear about listening to what apps and services people wanted. At that time, the iPhone had only just come out, but it had no front-facing camera. The hardware, being blunt, wasn't quite up to the standards that we needed for Skype to work in a performant way. So mobiles up until that point have been integrated largely through Skype Credit, which was we integrated onto the most basic of phones. They were hugely popular because you didn't need a contract or anything at those times. What we rapidly realized as soon as we started going just beyond Windows into Mac and then onto other platforms that wanted these integrations is that, like you said, you needed a design system. Design systems hadn't matured at that time, and they weren't necessarily called design systems. They were just called GUI kits. And we had numerous repositories for the GUI kits for the platforms that we were integrating. For example, Asus video phones, the sort of things that you're now seeing from Google and Facebook, where it's just a pure VC machine with a calendar and email. We'd done all of those very early on, and they were hugely popular. So the GUI kits had inherited certain properties of the platform, particularly when you went into TVs and onto very low bit basic phones. Some were even black and white because they were just doing audio calls. What we had to establish was not necessarily the GUI kit, but actually it was the app framework and the various states that were very much needed to run a basic version of Skype. So you needed a contact list, you needed a chat state, and you needed a live state. And then you needed all the bits that joined all that together, which was adding someone, all the error mechanisms, and then you needed all the management capabilities. So that was really a large portion of the entire team's work, was devising the app architecture with engineers. Once we cracked that, it was fairly easy to say what is the minimum required to run Skype on the most basic of devices. And then what is the maximum supreme experience that we would want. And at that time, that was the desktop apps. They had the most horsepower, GPU, CPU, etc., in order to run and do decoding on the device because it was a peer-to-peer network. So really, really impressive stuff. I can't speak highly enough of the amazing engineering talent at Skype at the time. They were real trailblazers. But design's role at that time was devising the GUI kits and the app architecture. As we matured, and Skype's history just a little bit, I suppose we were bought and sold 3 times, eBay, then to private equity, Silver Lake, and then finally to Microsoft. It wasn't really until we joined Microsoft that we started our design system in earnest, when we started devising Skype for Web, which is plug-in less, Skype equipped. And we devised the system called Matter, which you've probably never heard of. It never got made public, but it was very, very impressive, if I do say so myself. I did not build it. The team built it. Some wonderful minds that are still at Microsoft. And it was really one of the first things that we did was to create the motion language and get that into production-ready code. I could wax lyrical about this all day, but I can give you some names. Joe Phillips, Andres Kolar, Maciek, Bobby Rayett, Mark LaCroce. So many of these amazing brains actually devised plugins for the likes of After Effects, for Illustrator, for Sketch, that spat out production-ready code for engineers to implement. You've probably heard of Lottie, which is kind of basically the public version of what we created, probably slightly better under the hood, admittedly. And that was really the beginnings of a design system where engineers and designers were really kind of collaborating to make the UI as consistent as possible across the platforms. And of course, we had to do that in integrating with Microsoft at the same time,
right?
Which was going through a massive rebrand in their Microsoft design language, and we were part of that team to help devise that. So many moving parts. My second office was seat 60K on B887 to Seattle. I was there all the time. So the complexity just was exponential in terms of what the design system had to support across basically almost every platform on the planet.
And I mean, so at that time, people just began to really fathom what design systems meant. And nowadays, even smaller companies are also thinking about that. How has that changed now that you are at Skyscanner? How has that changed? I mean, when you started Skyscanner, was that all there? How much did you need to influence what you've learned at previous positions in that regard? What was the situation there?
Well, one of the things that we learned at Skype and Microsoft was the value of a design system to help give some sense of guidelines across all these disparate platforms. When I joined Skyscanner, there were two people working on the kind of first iteration of that, and it was called Living Styles. It was basically, as I recall, it was CSS and mix-ins to basically try and bring some sensibility to all the different button styles. So it started off very much in its infancy. And of course, the work of Brad Frost in Atomic Design was a real helpful metaphor for the business to understand and for engineering to understand what we were trying to accomplish. So, and then when I came in, it was really kind of evangelizing that at exec level as what were the benefits. And the main benefit there is speed to delivery and cost saving, because you build once and reuse often.
Right.
As it matures and as it develops, we realized very quickly that we needed a slightly different mechanism to control the experiments that we were running and to also control the themes. And the themes were being derived from the partner brands like Virgin Atlantic or Delta or British Airways, where we integrated their brand into our brand. So you needed to do runtime theming, which was quite a breakthrough.
What's that? Sorry, how do I understand that?
So when a person lands on Skyscanner and you want to buy the ticket from British Airways, we can theme the page according to British Airways branding rather than ours. Okay. So you have, at a very high level, you have theming switches. And to those people that know design systems, that's quite an important thing to be able to do. So yes, it's been very successful. You can all check it out on backpack.github.io. That's our public facing, and you can pick up and use our design system if you want.
Exciting. How do you? I mean, now that you switch to the kind of travel space, what would interest me is how do you think about innovation in the travel space? I mean, especially like when I look at a lot of the travel sites, they all look kind of similar. How do you differentiate? How do you think about that topic?
Well, that's a good topic. I think one thing that we struggle with as a design community is the business goals are very heavily geared towards optimization and conversion of customers. One of the issues that I think, and this is my opinion, not necessarily the opinion of Skyscanner, so let's be clear about that, is you have a frequency issue. Most people come to travel sites, regular folks, once or twice a year. There is a huge temptation to therefore bring out your entire arsenal of weaponry to close that sale, which leads to what I called perma anxiety. Am I really getting a good deal? Can I really trust this information? And there's all these peripheral messaging, pressure messaging that comes in as well, like hurry, only 2 seats left, 2 rooms left. And I think that taints the entire industry quite a lot, which doesn't lead to long-term trust. The other part is because there is that desire for the business to increase conversion and so on, you end up going into experimentation, where you basically do multivariate tests on almost everything in the funnel. Some things work, some things don't. But when people are going to an average of, I think it is about an average of 20 different travel sites before they make a booking, there's no wonder that the patterns that each of them compound will have an effect on the next one and the next one. So you end up with this kind of global homogenization due to experimentation, where they all end up looking the same, because the pattern and muscle memory associated with each one is just compounded and compounded. And it takes a very brave company to break out of that mold. But once one company has done that and really started pushing, then others start to follow suit. But it takes a very brave business to do that, because how long will a business keep going when the numbers aren't necessarily increasing? So of course the rollback to a previous version is quite pronounced.
But I mean, how did you? Because you still have to sell something. Because I was, frankly, I told you before this talk, when we had a quick chat, I was quite surprised when I actually went to Skyscanner and actually looked. Okay, so you don't have these, like, there's only 2 rooms left and you have only 10 minutes and stuff like that. How did you go to your bosses and have this conversation where it's like this conversion rate optimization business part versus, the long-term effect of your user experience? How does a conversation like that go, and how would you recommend other businesses to have this conversation inside their company?
No, it's a very good question. One of the reasons why I joined Skyscanner is the culture. And the culture is obviously made up of a set of principles and values. One of the key ones that was very apparent was that the business always wanted to do the right thing for the customer. Now that's easier said than done when you have to hit business targets. But one of the key things before I joined as a proof of this, and this is the ultimate proof, whether you really do put the customer first, is how much are you prepared to do the right thing for the customer and hurt the bottom line of your business? So I'll give you one example. When doing a search on Skyscanner Web, and this is 4 years ago, you were able to do comparisons with other sites, which meant London, New York, here's the dates, search. Now there were just some checkboxes, which was, do you want to compare with lastminute.com and with Kayak and so on? We would charge Kayak and so on an advertising fee for popping up their website under hours as soon as you hit search. And users, guess what? Hated it. Absolutely hated it. So many complaints. Why have you opened up all these browser windows? It's spamming me, etc., etc. But it was generating tens of millions a year.
Right.
And we said, no, it's not good for the customer. It will not earn long-term trust. And that philosophy has been maintained. And therefore, internally and externally, we always say we are the traveler first travel company. We will always put the traveler's needs in front. So when it comes to things like pressure messaging, hurry, only 2 rooms left, and that kind of thing, we won't do it because it doesn't help. It might get you short-term better conversion, but then ultimately everything starts to have to shout.
But then, so can you talk a bit more about the principles that you apply inside Skyscanner? And I think almost more importantly than also, because everybody can have principles or like write them down somewhere, but how do you build teams around those principles? And I mean, how do you hire new folks that actually are in line with those principles, and how do you make sure that those are consistently applied, even when you're not there, let's say?
Yeah, well, one of the best ways to affect behavior is to say that you're going to be measured on that behavior. So whenever we do performance reviews, it's how much has this person or this team demonstrated they have put the traveler first. So that's one thing. The second thing is you have to evangelize all the user testing that goes on, so you get people as close to the customer as possible. Now, I know that I'm not saying anything particularly revolutionary or new, but when you've got a company that does have a very clear understanding of itself and its principles, there is no point in having principles and values if you're just going to break them. You have to uphold them, and you have to constantly repeat them, and you have to constantly demonstrate why something is good or bad for the traveler, and that in turn brings out an internal mantra that then becomes part of the DNA of the company. So for example, internally, our DNA is traveler first, partner second, Skyscanner third, in that order. And it's always a balancing act. We're still running a business, but we will always default to putting the traveler first, because that's how you ultimately build long-term trust. One of the aspects I would just say, when actually starting to have this conversation about how do we codify it with the leadership in the business, is what is our Achilles heel as a business? What are we actually trying to fix as a business model for the traveler? And I'm sure you're fairly familiar with Skyscanner. Is the way I characterized it was like a wonderful calculator. A calculator is, input, output, you get the result, and it goes back in the drawer. It's not very emotional. It's very functional. And that's all good. That gets you to a certain level. But now put that in the context of travel, which is what's called an asset-heavy business, which is largely around your memories and emotions and so on. It's not just functional.
Right.
It's incredibly...
It's a bit like fashion or food. Yeah.
It makes you up, and it makes you the character that you are when you experience other cultures and so on. So having this blend of functional and emotional is really important, and of course that's where designers really love to bring those things together. And I well remember a company meeting where I gave a presentation to the whole company. It was about making ourselves more than just a calculator. We want a relationship with our customers. You don't have a relationship with a calculator.
Right.
So what are the emotional components that we will start to layer in to show that we actually really do understand travel and we understand you, the customer? And that was a fairly straightforward and easy conversation, if I'm being blunt. It just required the design team to actually show what that might look like and how that might work via prototypes and you might call it concept cars, where you can kind of paint the North Star of, hey, look, this is where we think the experience can go. So then you start to break it down, and then you end up taking the business on that journey as we go, well, we're more than just about flights. It's actually got to be about trips, because we're doing flights and hotels and car hire and etc. So therefore, the experience must shift from being flight-centric to trip-centric. Okay, great, because then we start to get a flight booked and then a hotel booked via attach. And if you organize your model around that, you actually then can accelerate the flywheel of the business. That's just one example of how one type of conversation went. Other conversations were far more emotional. And I can give you one more example.
Please.
This one kind of brings a few wry smiles to folks that heard me talk about this. But if I were to do it with the audience here, it would be hands up, who has a partner? I'll do it with you, Sandro. You have a partner?
No, not right now.
Okay. Oh, well, then it falls a little bit flat. If you were to have a partner, my next question would be, do you love them?
I surely would.
You would. And then I would say, prove it. How would you prove that you love your partner? Show me the algorithm. Give me the number. Okay. You say, no, that's not how it works. Of course, that's not how it works. You would say, look at my actions, look at my behaviors, look at my attitude towards my partner. Look at the things I do for them, how much time I want to spend with them, how much time I want to understand what their hopes, fears, dreams are. Okay. That being said, let's flip that round to the business. We put the traveler first, right? We love the traveler. We love our customer. Prove it. What would you do? What little thing would you do? In a relationship, it's not always the big gestures.
Right.
It's the little things you do every single day. Think about that. Think about that every time you're designing a system. How will it make the traveler feel? How will it demonstrate that you love them and put them first in everything that you do? And that seemed to hit a note with the majority of the company. So often it's just little stories.
Yeah.
And it's a way to sell those seeds. What you're doing is you're setting up a whole grander kind of universal principle of what the business purpose is all about, which is to put the traveler first. And then you're setting out your vision. And then you're setting out, well, if that's our vision, then how will we go about doing these things? That's your values, the things that you hold dear, the things that you won't ever do. Because often I find that it's the things you say you won't do are the more important things than the things you will do. Because that gives you the guardrails. And then you start to develop your design language that reflects that.
Do you have like a not to do list? Do you have like a list that says like these are the things we never do, or is that kind of implicitly given?
Well, I've given one already. Things like putting pressure messaging in our apps. You start to develop these things as you go, and they become part of the DNA. Never gossip about someone behind their backs. And that's another value.
Yeah, and I mean, so how do you you're still, you as a design leader are still in. I mean, you still have to make business decisions, right? I mean, how do you think about your role as let's say as a manager versus as a design leader? You know what I mean? Like the business aspects of it versus actually shaping these cultural things that you're now talking about. I mean, you still have to, and I guess many people in the audience have a similar problem, right? I mean, on the one side you have these principles, and then on the other side you have these business needs. And so how do you solve that tension?
Well, there's always going to be that tension. So you have to acknowledge that. And that's where you have to start making hard trade-offs. And the business will always have to do that because it's running a business. So as a leader, you're ultimately putting your customer first but you're still running a business. So you're going to always have those in tension. And there are very rigorous and long debates about how to make those trade-offs. So when it comes to having your sort of which hat you wear at any given time, the management side is really about the kind of the performance of the people and setting up the environment for them to flourish. Leadership, in my opinion, is actually just simply this. It is to lead. It is to lead from the front. And then you have, effectively, you are the role model. So it's do as I do, not just do as I say. And you're setting up the kind of principles for how management will operate. So when we looked at this, and this is something that we have devised as a leadership team at Skyscanner, is sometimes people are actually quite reticent to say what they lead and what they're going to be held accountable for. And we have a very simple framework, which is in a given team, and we run tribes and squads. In a squad, you'll have a group of people, different disciplines and so on. And it's very important that squad has an understanding of who leads what. So we come together and we basically, before the meeting, you're given, I think we use Trello. And there's a column which says, I lead, and I support, and I can't let go of. And each person does this.
That's a good one.
Blindly. Okay. Then you come together, and you then have this discussion, which is, I thought I was leading that. You say you're leading that. Okay. Okay. Well, if you really want to lead that, you'll lead it, and I will support you. And then and you go round and you hash that out. And it's very important, because then you go, well, if I'm leading it, then I'm accountable for it. And you can hold me to account. If I say I'm going to do it, then I do it. And if I don't, then on me it is. And then there's always these things that come up, which is what I feel I can't let go of. There's sometimes there's these emotional things that
totally.
If I let go of this, the business will fall apart. And you have that discussion, and then it's often, oh really? If you did stop doing that, what would happen? And you realize actually there's a lot of things you can just let go of, and it's okay. And there's other things that actually, if you did let go of it, the business really would fall apart. So you have to have someone on it. And often those things are around processes and governance, because that's really important that you have an operational model that keeps the monitor of the health and well-being of the team at large. So a very simple framework. We try and keep these as simple as we possibly can, so that we can go as fast as we possibly can. But that's just one example of how we view the different dimensions of leadership.
I actually really liked one of the quotes that I read from you, which was like, or mantra, maybe you can say, like, inspiring from the front and leading from the back, which I like. I don't know if you have that from somewhere or if that's yours, but I really like that.
Well, I think sometimes you do actually have to just lead from the front, and you have to be, and there is a general principle, which is people are much more easily drawn than they are driven. So that quote is probably a few years ago now. I might modify it since then. I think my natural disposition as a leader is what's been characterized as a shepherd. If you were to look at it as a shepherd, the shepherd will lead the sheep out to green pasture, and whilst the sheep are grazing and so on, the shepherd kind of retires and allows the sheep to autonomously, do their job, and then leads them onto the next field and keeps watch over them. So I suppose that's my metaphor in that respect. But it's not cracking the whip from behind, like driving people. No way. It's not that at all. It's in servant leadership style. So
I guess it's like knowing when to be in the front and when to kind of retreat into the back a little bit as well.
Yeah, and I think that's important when you start defining what I have called the 3 A's. Now, this is not just me that's devised this. There are many brilliant minds here, and we've kind of, over the years, assembled this framework. The 3 A's are this: accountability, autonomy, and alignment.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? You need all 3, but which one is the higher priority over another? We have asserted that accountability is the primary thing that you want in people.
Mm-hmm.
That they will do the things that they will say they'll do, and they will own it.
And they take ownership, exactly.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So if that's the primary one, fine. Then the next 2 is autonomy and alignment. Now, I will always favor giving someone more autonomy. There is never such a thing as 100% autonomy. No one has that.
Right.
You're always accountable to something or someone. And you're always trying to align to the business goals and objectives. So the default is alignment. The default is autonomy, knowing that they will self-align because they are accountable. Now, that sounds a little bit kind of circular reasoning, but you have accountability, and I'll talk more about this in my talk at UX Live.
Mm-hmm.
But it's been very helpful for people to understand what is expected of them. So yeah, I won't spoil that everything, but that's just a basic outline of the framework.
But also, I mean, you mentioned before, putting processes in place. I mean, also in the design world, and so how do you make sure that while you have processes in place, that the creative freedom of the team is not undermined, so that you kind of leave some room for creativity?
Yeah, absolutely. Processes are good. Where I don't like processes is where you use process as a proxy for success. In other words, well, we followed the process. Why hasn't it been successful?
Right.
Right. You can't do that kind of. That's the wrong kind of reasoning. Processes are there to help people and keep the business in line in an aligned fashion, and make it predictable for the business to understand when things will be done.
Mm-hmm.
That's all that a business ever wants, is some level of predictability.
Right.
That's why Scrum and Kanban and Agile have been so popular, is because you can start to get people's cadence and velocity and so on. So it gives some sense of predictability to the business. But what we have done is, whether you like it or not, and there's no particular creative framework that's perfect, is we looked at all the different frameworks and process patterns and so on, and we just very simply and lightweight adopted the double diamond as the most basic way of explaining to the business where we are in our process.
Yeah.
And that's been actually very helpful. What you then do is, obviously, because within the first diamond, you can then exercise your creative freedom to explore.
Like you open up.
And you can open it up. So all we're saying is, look, we're exploring, we're diverging, and in 2 weeks, we're going to start to converge on a thing, and we'll come to this point where we need to come together, agree, disagree, and commit to the solution that we're then going to go ship. And we try and do that as quickly as possible. So that's it, really. It's not trying to be too clever about it all. It's just from a reporting perspective where you are in the process. One thing, though, to note, and I'm sure design folks will be interested in this, but you have product design reviews, you have critiques, you have peer designing, you have work in progress sessions, you have all hands, you have all these ceremonies and rituals. One thing that is important, I think, is that you need to explain where you are in the process in order to elicit what type of feedback you're really wanting. For example, in the first stages, you're probably about, 20% on the journey.
Right.
In which case, the feedback is going to be quite high level.
Right.
It's not going to be prescriptive. It's going to be kind of directive. Yeah, keep going in this direction, just a little bit here. As you go through that and it gets closer and closer, things start to get way more precise and specific, and often prescriptive. Move that here, do that there, do that here, and you got to be very clear on what type of feedback you're asking, and therefore what type of feedback you're going to be given.
So what you're saying is, whenever you want feedback, that you're clear about where you are in the process, so you get the feedback that is actually appropriate.
Absolutely. Very, very important. And of course, it's up to the person receiving the feedback whether they want to receive it or not.
Right.
And I think as a leader, the thing that I have learned is when to be directive and when to be prescriptive. And often the prescriptive comes when things aren't necessarily being aligned. And therefore you can say to the team, okay, what I need to do here is align you to this, and this is the reason why I'm maybe intervening, or maybe why I'm giving you this very, very specific, because maybe there's only in a matter of hours before we have to do this.
Right.
But as soon as you outline why you're doing that, I've never really had any pushback from that, as long as you're clear. It's when it's the wrong feedback at the wrong time in the wrong order that it just, people are like, oh, I can't deal with it.
Yeah.
So we've
and it also, I mean, it also sometimes, if it's too directive, it also undermines then the ownership that you kind of gave the person in the first place, if you're not understanding it when you're giving feedback, or if it's at the at what point you're giving the feedback.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I was going to say, one of the things that we often joke about is when people give feedback and it's phrased as a question, but actually it's a request. In other words, like,
we all know that.
Have you thought about moving the button from left to the right hand side?
Right.
Just remove the question mark at the end. And just say what you mean.
Totally.
And it's training people to ask the right questions. And there's a great book, by the way, which is Leading by Asking Questions.
Leading by Asking Questions. Okay.
Yeah.
Noted. That's actually an interesting thing, right? I mean, also the directness of feedback. So you manage 50, 60 people all over the world. I mean, how do you also give feedback, especially design feedback, across cultures? That probably also varies. Or do you have like a process enough that doesn't come up much anymore? Or because I always feel like culture is a big element of that as well.
Yes. This is why you go through these different kind of process and rituals that a team goes through at different levels of scale. As you get larger, obviously you have to be very clear, and I have to be very clear with my leadership team that they are accountable for driving that piece of work with their team.
Yeah.
And what an intervention would look like, then I describe and go, if it's all going fine, you won't hear from me. And that's proper delegation. If I'm still touching it, I haven't really delegated.
Right.
So they have every right to tell me, back off, I've got this. You've delegated this to me. I'm responsible. You should hold me to account. And therefore, when you're going across different teams and different locations, it's really important then for them to each understand what they're accountable for and what stream of work they really own, and how they should work together, because they're we're peers. So I'll be honest with you, when it comes to geodisbursement like we have, it is really tough. There's no way of sugarcoating it. The different cultures, different languages, the nuance of how designers like to convey things, and it can be quite non-specific and emotional and not very practical and so on. And we're constantly trying to improve on that. What we have found, though, is that when people are paired up in the right ways, that's often the quickest way to get feedback and get things moving. It's about really clearly describing, you're on the hook for this. You have this degree of accountability, this degree of autonomy. Here's how you can make decisions. If you need any more information, I am here. Ask me these types of questions, otherwise you can go fix these. And I took the entire team through the accountability ladder when I first joined. I can talk to people about this, but I don't know whether people will be interested. But the accountability is a great framework for how we talk about holding people to account.
Yeah, I think that's very good advice, actually, because I just hear this coming up over and over. That's culture is an issue, but I like that framework of accountability because it can span across cultures. Actually, I think that's very very good advice. Also, we have. I just saw we're already only 10 minutes left. So
okay, wow.
Yeah, it goes fast. I have one last question, so we might go 5 minutes over, but I really wanted to ask that, like, because you told me before that there's an announcement, you're going to make an announcement somewhere next week. How do you think about like incremental design changes versus like actually, kind of starting from scratch and rethinking a whole website or app or experience? Because I see with a lot of the processes that we talked about before, it's very incremental, and we sometimes don't take a step back from something that might got old and into one direction, and maybe the times changed, that it's sometimes maybe necessary to do like a bigger change. How do you think about that? And after this answer, we're going to go into the Q&A. So please ask the questions and upvote.
No, thanks for the question. It's one that I think we've had the most often here at Skyscanner. We have a very successful and profitable business as a meta search company. But like we said, it does have an Achilles heel, which is it's input, output. Now go get it yourself on BA.
Right.
Bye-bye, you're on your own.
Right.
That's tricky because we're very profitable on that model, and that's very good. So in some ways, as a designer, you're not looking to seek to disrupt that per se, but as a business, you are very aware that if you don't build the thing that kills you, someone else will. So you're constantly looking at your flanks. One of the things, as I described that Achilles heel, means that if you're waving goodbye to every single customer, how can you really service that customer through their entire life cycle? So I know you just alluded to some things that we might be releasing. So watch this space over the next couple of months as we seek to fix that. In other words, becoming a transactional business where we will actually take the bookings ourselves. We successfully launched that in Singapore and Australia, and that'll be coming to other markets very soon, which then means that we can take care of the customer. That, in effect, was a collective decision, not just with myself, but with product, with engineering, with leadership. And you start to model that out, what that means for the business. And it becomes the thing that is very necessary then for the business to go through. So what we did is you can carry on incrementally on the current business, but you need to be exponentially minded on the new business model.
Right.
You can take much greater risks and go much faster. When it comes to the operational risk, the risk register, there are operational parameters where if we want to change something in the product, I don't know, let's pick something very trivial. Let's change the button color, the main CTA color on the website, because we believe it will bring a bit more of a harmonious design, and it will convey our values a bit better, etc. All this kind of stuff that designers will do. The business will say, okay, here's your operational parameters. You can go minus 0.5% on revenue, on total or GMV. And if you go below that, you can't. You have to roll back. But if it's within those tolerances, you can proceed. So you need to establish those kind of rules of governance for making changes, even when it's incremental. But the bottom line is you will always end up in an incremental place with certain business things that work, because you've got to keep the business going on. It's then to find the next things that you can be far more risk taking to try and drive the business forward in other ways.
So you're doing it almost like in separate teams, basically, separate task forces almost, to then work on a new product in that sense.
Yeah, in some ways that's the easiest way to do it. You then do have certain kind of cultural problems that arise from that, which is, hey, why wasn't I put on the new thing, and why am I still on the old thing?
Right, of course. Everybody wants to be on a new thing, or many people probably. Yeah.
Yeah, so you have to be careful on how you balance that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so actually, we now go into the Q&A. So people already asked a lot of questions, and we start with let's not start with the most upvoted one, with the boss question. Let's do that at the end. They have some more time for the other questions. So Andy Robson asks, can you build a culture from the bottom up by influencing directors to take it seriously? I mean, I guess versus, does it have to come from top down? Like you maybe mentioned, when you came in, it was kind of already there, this strong culture. Like how? But I also know you brought about culture shifts. So can you elaborate that, bottom up versus top down?
Well, the simple answer to that, Andy, is absolutely. And if you have a good leadership team that cares about culture, they will listen to all stratas of the business. And they must make themselves very available and create that emotional, and psychological safety, so that people can say what's on their mind without fear of repercussion. So yes, you can, and you should be able to. There's always going to be a meeting in the middle. There are some things where executives are operating at a different altitude to the rest of the business, and therefore will always see things in a probably a longer term arc than the rest of the business. So you're just constantly just trying to map that to what is currently known and felt in the business, and taking what you might call is the main bias of the company forward on that journey. But yeah, at Skyscanner it happens all the time. We can say things, make them very apparent to leadership, and leadership listen. One of the ways in which we do that, just quickly, is we use a product called Culture Amp, and we use that every year.
Culture Amp, you're saying?
Culture Amp, yeah. And that's basically, it's a wonderful tool that surveys the entire company on many different facets of team and organizational health. And that does influence the culture and the decisions that leadership take. So yes, there's many ways to do it.
But you've got to be conscious about it, right?
Oh, 100%, yeah.
Next question from Avinash. Do you have a specific process to feed customer insight back to the business?
Yes, we do. I wouldn't say it's particularly codified, but the process at the moment is one of qualitative and quantitative. On the qualitative side, that would be in my team, user research, which can go and generate insights on a certain time horizon. But I would suggest that if you go too far out, you don't actually connect those back into the business to actually act upon in the near term. So you have to choose where in the time horizon you're actually placing your research and insights. And it's very important that you do that in a business of our scale with quantitative data as well. So user research and data science, get put together. And the way I characterize that is, if quantitative is saying what is happening, the qualitative says why it happens. And you need both for the business to run.
And that actually goes already into the next question. I mean, it's a bit so maybe we can talk a bit more about that. So does Skyscanner use A/B test, or I guess multivariate testing at all for all new features, or like, I mean, how much quantitative data do you gather for new features versus like maybe you rely more on qualitative data? How do you have like a split, or does it vary on the situation? Like how do you think about that whole research, quantitative and qualitative? How do I have to envision that?
Well, to answer the question, yes, we do
Yeah.
do multivariate testing. What we have learned though is that whilst you can test everything, not necessarily everything that you test is important, and it can slow you down, and you can end up in sort of analysis paralysis where everything that you do doesn't actually really change anything. It's just another change. What you're really trying to do is drive business metrics better. So when it comes to qualitative, I would say that informs the concept and what the customers really care about when you're trying to develop a new feature. And you try and protect that at all costs, because that's effectively your MVP, if I were to use a loaded term. Right. And then when shipping that, you're testing the variability, the variable aspects of that concept, to see which bits have cause and effect that drive an improvement in the metrics. But like I said before, we were testing absolutely everything. We are doing less of that now, because we actually want to take more of a sort of a bolder approach and a courage of our convictions that this is actually better. Naturally, the proof is in the pudding. So
Right.
very, very simply, when we have a new feature, we will put it out to a control cohort. I mean, those that know how to do experimentation will know what I'm talking about. You'll have a control, you'll have a certain cohort, you'll do that maybe to 1%. You'll see what it's like over a period of time. And then you can either ramp up to see if there are any kind of false positives or negatives, ghosts in the data, etc. And that's all very scientific. But it can lead you into that incremental mindset,
Right.
Which is, you've got to take things on balance.
And I guess this already kind of answers this question from Will as well a little bit. I mean, how did you go about understanding how users make choices about flights? Maybe goes into what you mentioned at the very end on what's going to change with Skyscanner, and how did what you learn from them affect your team's design choices? So I guess it goes a little bit into that, but maybe you can elaborate. Yeah. I mean, how do you also prioritize? You know, I mean, how do you what you learn then prioritize into what's actually important?
Yeah. So sorry, I'm just reading the question. Yes. Understanding how users make choices about flights, and how did what you learn from them then affect your team? Well, in effect, our results page, we call it the day view, which is you're on specific days where you want to fly. That's effectively like a new homepage. That's where all the traffic is. So you have an amazing amount of eyeballs on there. You have a lot of data that you can analyze there. What filters they're applying, what they're trying to do, with the information, how quickly they go in, find out more information, come back out, etc. And it's quite actually easy to determine what they care about. Where it becomes tricky is they actually exhibit different patterns on different platforms and in different markets, and therefore that's about product market fit. So I'm trying to think about what would be one of the things they care about. Here's an example. We released about a year ago an eco feature. Let's call it an eco feature. It's just a simple badge that when you're searching from flights to New York, we will badge the most sustainable and ecologically friendly flights. And that's based on insights that an emerging trend that people are caring more and more about the environment and want to make better choices. So that's the insight. Then it was, well, what data do we have available that we could actually start to address this and talk to that audience? And there was a whole lot of data being crunched about that. So we shipped that, which was based on, here's the aircraft type that flies that route, here's how it's calculated, and so on. And then you're doing a comparison. So it's basically the lesser of out of all the evils.
Right.
And one of the things that we learned from that is people were getting in touch with us very, very quickly, just kind of going, I can't believe you're doing that feature. That is amazing. I can now actually make more informed decisions. And that starts to speak to our mission as a business, which is to lead the global transformation to modern and sustainable travel. So that gives you one example, Will. I hope that was interesting. There are lots more, slightly more boring ones, but you can see that feature in the product itself.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Do you have, so we have to slowly close here. So I saw a few people are asking about like your favorite resources, like books, and what kind of design tools do you like, prototyping tools and books, and adding other resources. Do you have some? You can just mention them, and then we'll put them in the chat and for people if you have them on your mind. Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's one of my sayings, but we produce a lot of flat mocks, don't we, as designers? If a picture paints 1,000 words, a prototype will save 1,000 meetings. And in that case, I am a big fan of Framer X.
Framer X.
Framer X. Oh boy, that's good stuff. Yes, of course, there's Sketch, there's Figma, there's Marvel, there's Principle, there's Envision, blah, blah, blah. There's so many, but I'm not afraid in saying that Framer X is my favorite.
All right.
So that's on a tool. Yeah, we use Dropbox. We love Dropbox. We'd be lost without Dropbox. Do we love Jira? We've got a love-hate relationship with Jira.
Right. That's many.
But having said that, we do love Atlassian. We think they're a great company. And one of the resources there is their playbooks, their video playbooks on things like how to do a pre-mortem, and they're really lovely resources. That's good operational governance of a team to understand all those methods. In terms of, I'd say my favorite books. There's so many. I'll reveal my little cheat. My cheat is this. It's a little app, and it's called Blink List.
Yeah, I know Blink.
You may have heard of it. It enables you to read the main premise of a book without having to read the entire book. And what I do is I use that to kind of skim it, and then I will go and read the entire book. So that's a good way of kind of getting the précis, the summary, etc., and then dig deeper into the examples. Some of the books that I've read over the years that have been very helpful to me. There is Jim Collins, From Good to Great. That's great. That's very good. The one that we mentioned earlier. What other ones are there? I think Deep Work is very helpful. And then more recently, I think the two books I've enjoyed a lot are, I think it's Jake Knapp's book, Making Time, and Julie Zhou's book, The Making of a Manager. In fact, The Making of a Manager comes very close to home, and very good examples. And of course, her writings are wonderful. So kudos to Julie. There's so many. I'll have a think about some more to send to the group.
Yeah, you can always share them with me, and I will share them with the audience after we're finished. If you want to send me your reading list. Okay, So then we come to the final question. Why is Steve called Buzz? 19 upvotes.
Oh dear. Well, it's a real anticlimactic answer.
That's okay.
Back in the day when Toy Story came out, I think there was about someone who shall remain nameless, but who is the founder of Us Two. I won't make him nameless. Matt Mills at Us Two gave me my nickname whilst we were at uni together.
Okay.
And it stuck.
And it stuck.
So now I embrace it. I embrace it. Yeah, sorry, folks. I'm sure you wanted some big elaborate story, but that's all it is.
Great. Thank you very much. Maybe the very last thing, I mean, is there anything you would like to kind of instill into the audience or leave the audience with that's important to you? Some kind of advice you would like to give to aspiring design leaders? Anything like that?
Oh, that's a big question. And I don't really want to sound like, I suppose, like everyone else, but I suppose my personal mantra, and this was passed down to me from my grandparents and my father and so on, is a very simple saying, which is stoop to conquer. Don't have hubris or ego or pride. Really seek to understand where the other person's coming from, what they're doing, and take the low position to win them round, and then lead them and draw them on that journey. Don't try and crack the whip or going competitive and argumentative and gearing for a fight. Never, in my experience, has that ever really produced good results, and it doesn't produce good, trusting relationships either.
Well, that's a beautiful note to leave the audience with. Where can they reach you? I mean, should they email you? Should they follow you on Twitter? What's your go-to?
I am on Twitter. I'm on LinkedIn. It's Steve Buzz Pearce. You can email me. I can't promise that I'll get back, but perhaps we'll start off on DM me on and follow me on Twitter. Not that I'm trying to get my numbers up or anything. I just think it's probably the easiest way to filter things, if you don't mind. And I'll do my best to get back to folks. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you for hosting me.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much. It was very insightful. And I'm sure folks that listened to you learned a lot today.
Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.